Good day. I'm President Ulysses S. and you joined me today in the library, and I welcome your joining me. Today, I should like to reflect about avoiding war with Spain over Cuba and give you some of my thoughts about what was on my mind during that period of 1868 through my presidency, early in 69, 70s through 73, 75, during all of which the Cuban Rebellion was going on. In 1868, some of the landowners in Cuba rebelled against the Spanish government, and that started what became the 10 Years' War, finally ending in 1878 when the Spanish government agreed to give amnesty to all the rebels and stop the killing, stop the fighting. But it had been going on for a couple of years when in 1870, after I had taken the executive mansion, there was a great deal of war fervor in America. Several of the major newspapers, particularly New York newspapers, were in favor of us going to war against Spain. Indeed, my own Secretary of War, John Rawlins, was eager to take up the banner of the rebels in Cuba because so much of what they were doing to try to overthrow the Spanish nobility out of Spain, which was draining them dry and governing them harshly, also maintaining 500,000 slaves in Cuba, and Puerto Rico had about 50,000. So there was much support here in America to join the rebels in Cuba. But Hamilton, and I was inclined to support them for a while, but Hamilton Fish, my Secretary of State, talked with me and reasoned with me and said, if you grant belligerent rights to the Cuban rebels, which they were avidly seeking with us, then you are going to open the door wide to the Spanish Navy, which was very powerful, much more powerful than our own Navy, which we had essentially disassembled at the end of the Civil War. We had nothing that could match the Spanish Navy, even closely. So Fish was telling me, if you grant belligerent rights to the Cuban rebels, you're going to swing wide the door to the Spaniards stopping our ships on the high seas and checking them to see if we're ferrying supplies to the rebels in Cuba. And stopping the ships is going to lead to, as he diplomatically put it, excitement amongst the U.S. population, and that would lead ultimately to war with Spain, and probably very quickly go through that succession. So he advised having a cooler head, and I agreed with that and came down on the wait early on for the wait and see. But on June the 13th of 1870, I issued this statement to Congress. Soon after the opening of the present session of Congress, all that was officially known by the government of the condition of affairs in Cuba was communicated, and from time to time since, all the correspondence that has taken place between Spain and the United States relative to Cuban affairs been given and furnished for the information of that body. Previous to the meeting of Congress, I adhered to the precedents of my predecessors in office in maintaining a strict neutrality in the affairs of Spain, with which government we were at peace. During the session, I have not felt myself justified in taking a step which might be attended with serious results without the advice of that body, the legislative branch of the government. 3 times since the beginning of the conflict in Cuba, American vessels protected by the United States flag have been captured upon the high seas and carried into Spanish ports. In but one instance has there been any reparations made, and then tardily. Up to the present time, though repeatedly demanded and often promised, no copies even have been furnished this government of the evidence upon which the other two vessels were condemned have been furnished to this government. In view of these facts, and the further fact that Spain, with all her armies and armament, the combined power of her army and navy, has not been able to suppress the rebellion, which had now continued almost 2 years, and in the view of the failure of Spain to protect American citizens, or to give them time to prove their innocence of complicity in conspiracy against Spanish authority, as 2 American prisoners who were executed declared their ability to do, and the proximity to our own shores of the seat of war, it has become a question how long we can permit this contest without further noticing it. And what is our duty to the unhappy belligerents, to humanity, and to ourselves? I believe the time has come when a decided protest should be entered by the United States against a further continuance of the strife in Cuba, and against the summary manner of taking the lives of prisoners almost as soon as captured. This grave question is submitted to Congress. And that was June the 13th of 1870. Well, as I said, fish had prevailed upon me not to recognize the belligerents, even though I was inclined to do so. And even though people in my own cabinet were wanting to recognize belligerents, and the rebels had set up a junta here in New York City and were indeed selling war bonds in the United States and selling them briskly to support the war against Spain. So we were tacitly recognizing them, not officially recognizing them or Spain as a belligerent. And I felt that that was the path to take. We were trying to avoid war and trying to do it through diplomacy. The Spanish government was very shaky and indeed had decided to go from a republic back to a monarchy. And we didn't know which way they were going to go in the negotiations over the Virginius. The Virginius. The Virginius was a blockade runner. It had been built during the war for the blockade running traffic between Havana and Mobile. And of course the war is over. It ends, and the Virgin, as it was named, is in other uses. In 1870, a couple of businessmen, American businessmen, bought it for, I don't recall the price. They paid the customs in New York $2,000 to register it, which was questionable and became the question later. And it began running in 1870, supplies, ammunition, troops, rebels to the rebels in Cuba. Made a number of runs, and at that time, it was indeed under the protection of the United States Navy. The Canandaigua was one vessel, and at the moment I don't recall the other, but there were at least 2 United States naval vessels that would run protection for it because we were recognizing it as a United States flag vessel. The Spanish did not do so. They, as I had said in my statement, they were stopping ships of ours on the high seas and searching them and pressing some people, passengers, and even crew. And this was a severe irritant for us as a country. We were hearkening back to what led up to the War of 1812 with British impressment. And the Virginius was actually about to leave in October of 1873. They were leaving a port, and the American consul told them, the Spaniards are waiting for you. They are going to shoot you if you're captured. And Captain Fry, I think Joshua Fry, but Captain Fry, who'd been 15 years in the United States Navy, then he went with the South during the war, became a Commodore in the Confederate Navy, was out of work after the war, had been employed by this questionable entity that bought the Virgin, redubbed it the Virginius, and was captaining that vessel. And he said he didn't think that the Spaniards would shoot anyone. They had to have repairs to their boilers, so they were running a little slow. And on October 30th, they're making a run to Santiago de Cuba Bay, and the Spanish warship Tornado spied them. And they fired across their bow. The chase was on. But because they were so heavily loaded with some war materials, even had 4 mercenaries on board the vessel, Captain Fry realized that they couldn't outrun the Tornado. So, and the Tornado was firing on them and blew away much of their upper deck. He pulled to, and they were taken into the port of Santiago de Cuba. And this was on October 30th of 73. On November the 4th, the 4 mercenaries on board the ship they were summarily shot in a firing squad. The Spanish governor there in Santiago had held a trial of sorts and declared the entire crew as pirates. On the 4th of November, the 4 men were shot. On the 7th of November, they chose, I know not how, 37 more crewmen, and this time Captain Fry, and shot all of them. Now, this crew is including at least 3 boys of 13 or younger. And Captain Fry is an American citizen. Many of the crew that has been shot without benefit of trial, the American consul is trying to get the Spanish governor there to stop the killing and hold trials. These men are American citizens and they claim innocence. He's ignoring them. But to complicate matters even more, as if they could be complicated by this time, many of those crew members were British citizens, and they're being shot too. So now Great Britain is involved. So the consul and the British consul notified their respective governments for instructions, and Captain Will Cushing of the USS Wyoming and a British warship are both dispatched to Santiago. And en route, on November the 8th, another 12 of the crew were pulled out and shot. So at this point, we have a number 53 people who have been executed by firing squad, American and British citizens, and under an American flag. So at the 53 number, the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy both arrive, and Captain Cushing advises the governor of Santiago de Cuba that if you don't cease and desist, we are going to shell your village into rubble. At this point, the governor made a wise decision and decided not to execute anymore. The United States Navy and the Royal Navy had said, stop. And he did, while waiting instructions from the Spanish government. Now, the Spanish government is insisting to our ambassador in Spain, Daniel Sickles, that it was not an American ship. It was flagged as an American ship, but there was nefarious dealings in the ownership. We said it's an American ship, and until we determine at a later time through our investigation, it's an American ship. And the investigation began. The negotiations between America and Spain and Britain and Spain went thusly. The British reached a settlement for the British subjects who'd been killed. Apparently they were mainly or all black sailors, citizens, and Spain agreed to pay the British government for the survivors of those men £7,500. We said that we wanted $2,500 for the families per man who was killed, which came to about $80,000 in coin. The Spanish government is resisting this, and we're still bristling. The last of the sailors were shot on November the 8th. On November the 27th in New York City, there is a large anti-Spain rally of people wanting to go to war with Spain, and I understood their anger. I had a pile of notes on my desk in the executive mansion from men, and quite a few of them from former Confederate soldiers who were volunteering their services. They said, we want to fight for the United States. I had a burgeoning war problem on my hands. And the Spanish, though, while they've always been off-putting with us, every year before I send my annual message to Congress in December, Spain promises, as Hamilton Fish called it, buttered parsnips, to say, we'll cooperate, we're going to be in the posture that is most favorable to our relations as nations and so forth. And they never did. Another issue underlying this was that I was very concerned that Spain, which was in bad financial shape, even worse governmental shape, monarchy to republic, back to monarchy, that if they didn't get right side up with Cuba and that rebellion, which they were not winning, by now getting into 1870, late 1874, into 1875, they're not winning the war, and it's been going on for 7 years. I was very concerned that they were going to negotiate with other countries in Europe and use Cuba as collateral for loans. If they did that, then the countries that were giving them money would then feel a proprietary position with Cuba. And I did not want that to occur. No other countries in the Western Hemisphere. I wanted to stay with the Monroe Doctrine. So I didn't want Spain to get into negotiations with other countries in Europe using Cuba as collateral for their international loans. And then Cuba becomes a pawn in a very broad and deadly international chess game. And I was wanting to prevent that, but all the time Spain is still stalling. We did our investigation and found that the Virginius was indeed illegally flagged. It was not an American vessel. Now, in our negotiations with Spain, we had set forth these conditions: that the Virginius would be returned to us, which it was on December the 17th of 73, and that as she left, the Spanish government would fire a salute to the American flag in the Santiago harbor. And if it was found that the Virginius was not an American vessel, that it was indeed a pirate rebel supporting vessel, as the Spanish government claimed it was, then they wouldn't have to fire a salute, which indeed they did not. And that the Spanish governor, Barrios, I believe was his name, that had those all of those 53 men summarily executed, that he would be arrested and dealt with, and that there would be reparations made to both the British subjects and the American citizens. Well, as it turned out, as I said, we found out to our chagrin and somewhat to our relief that it was not an American flag vessel. It was indeed registered under false pretenses to be a supply runner and troop transport for the Cuban rebels. The Virginius was returned to us on December 17th, put under tow, and promptly sank. The remaining prisoners, some 90 or so of them, were released. No more executions. The governor was arrested, but he died in prison before he could be tried, and the family members got their $7,500 for the British subjects, and the American families got their $80,000. And there were some special provisions made for the relief of the family of Captain Fry. And his family was at that time living in St. Louis. So the Virginius Affair was finally resolved in March of 1875, 2 years almost after it had gotten started. We didn't go to war with Spain. We were able to avoid that thanks to the cool-headedness of Hamilton Fish and my listening to the wisdom of his counsel. We got back our American vessel. The Spanish were still, they wanted us to finance the buying of the slaves. Now, one of the suggestions to resolve the issue of the rebellion was then buy the slaves. The Spanish government would pay the landowners for all of the 500,000 slaves and set them free. Puerto Rico, in fact, they had released their 50,000 slaves, but Cuba had 10 times that amount. So the Spanish government wanted the rebellion to stop. Hamilton Fish said, if you'll stop fighting and repair the injuries that have been done to everyone and guarantee that the freedom of the belligerents, then the fighting will be over. But Spain wanted the United States to guarantee the money that would be used to buy the slaves and end slavery in Cuba. And we weren't about to do that because we were certain if we did that, we would quickly be the party paying for all of those 500,000 slaves. As it was, the whole issue was resolved somewhat to our satisfaction. Primarily, we didn't go to war with Spain, and the United States Navy, a benefit was we realized that our Navy, which had been dismantled after the war, which had been an extremely powerful naval force, was whittled down to nothing. When we looked at that Spanish Navy, we realized we've got to have a stronger Navy than what we've got, and we built 5 new ships, and 1 warship and 4 somewhat lesser armed vessels, and our Navy began to grow again. So there was some benefit to this, but I should think primarily we didn't go to war with Spain. We exercised diplomacy, and even though the war was causing us angst here over the existence of slavery and a rebellion with which we were in sympathy, we did not recognize the Cuban rebels as belligerents. We did not get into war with Spain, and we resolved it through diplomacy. The good, cool-headed, adroit diplomacy guided by Hamilton Fish. I should also like to add, before I conclude, that Dan Sickles, being our ambassador to Spain, all he did was, I would liken it to the bull in the china shop. He was garrulous, argumentative, and only made the Spanish government angry. The President of Spain himself negotiated behind the scenes with Hamilton Fish here in America, and they requested that we move the negotiations to Washington. We promptly agreed. They promptly agreed, and Hamilton Fish did the negotiating personally in Washington City. Now, this did not sit well with our ambassador to Spain, Daniel Sickles. And when he offered to resign, I did not accept his resignation. But as soon as we resolved the Virginius Affair, we got our concessions, he resigned again, and I promptly accepted it and recalled him back. And I sent Ambassador Cushing over there, who was a Spanish scholar and was indeed involved with the Alabama claims and bringing the Alabama claims to a successful conclusion. Now, with those thoughts that I have shared with you, I think that I have said, for the moment, enough to completely address part 2 of avoiding war with Spain. I should like at this time, and I feel it entirely appropriate, to bring my remarks to a close. I appreciate you having joined me this day here in the library to hear about how we, in 1873 through 1875, through diplomacy and negotiation, avoided war with Spain. And I was pleased to have done that. So for the moment, I'm President Ulysses S. Grant, bidding you a fond adieu.